Welcome. After a record cold winter that went into overtime, it finally feels, well, almost like spring. Easter and Passover are just days ahead. It won't be long before our city parks blossom, and today, April 1st, marks the birth of a new fiscal year in the state of New York, with another new budget arriving on time for the 5th consecutive year. No increase in the minimum wage or a DREAM Act to help the undocumented with tuition, but a less than 2% increase in spending and ethics reforms and more. Our economics guru, Greg David, will be here to help us deconstruct the budget. Nationally renowned parks expert Tupper Thomas will also drop by to plant some ideas about funding New York City's numerous community parks where the bloom has been off the rose too long. But all that is later in the hour. Today, an extended conversation about Israel with a special guest. Before he gets the chance to relax and recline at a Passover table, we've invited the Israeli Consul General to New York to join us. He is Ido Aharoni, and he's here to share his thoughts with Jewish and all New Yorkers about the Israeli elections just held, the increased tensions with the United States that have been in the headlines, and less political topics like Israel's high-tech future and its international links to higher education here in New York. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you.
This will be more than 4 questions. First, tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up? How did you wind up being stationed in New York?
Well, I was born in Jaffa in 1962. I was raised in Cholon, which is a southern suburb of Tel Aviv. My family's been in the region for many, many years. My father's family came from Bukhara, which is now part of Uzbekistan, in 1870. They settled in Jerusalem. My mother's family came from Yemen in 1920. My mother was born in Tel Aviv and served in the military, went to school in Israel, came to the States to obtain my master's, worked for Israeli television, then joined the Foreign Service. I sold out, moved to the government.
Cholon, your hometown, not one of the Israeli cities that's well known around the world, but you were telling me off the air that it's a city that kind of reinvented itself.
Right. Cholon actually is one of the most fascinating case studies in the field of place branding, a place that had a very, very bad image as an industrial area plagued with crime. About 20 years ago, decided to develop its own competitive edge, which they didn't have before, and they decided to cater to children, to brand themselves as Israel's city of children, and then major heavy investment in infrastructure to support the strategy. They built a state-of-the-art children's museum, a water park for children, and the most important thing that they did, they created a series of playgrounds catering for toddlers that are based on classic children's books. So the design of the playground looks like a children's book, and it's called a Ganei Sipur in Hebrew, a themed playground for toddlers. They have 48 of them. It's a world-class enterprise.
Americans are suckers for things like that. If it worked in Cholon, maybe they can export it.
Well, we just had an event here last week in New York featuring their new endeavor and exposing it to the audience here in New York.
And how long have you been stationed here in
This
the
is
city?
this is my 4th year.
4th year in New York. The stats I have are that Jerusalem has less than 500,000 Jews. New York City has over 1 million. So which is the Jewish capital of the world?
Well, there's no question that New York, the greater New York area, if you consider Connecticut and New Jersey and the 5 boroughs and beyond, Long Island, is the largest Jewish community in the world outside of the state of Israel. There's no question about that.
Let's talk about the job of the Consul General in New York. Again, it's a title that not many people know. They hear ambassador, that person is in Washington. You're a Consul General, you have the title of ambassador, but stationed to the local region of New York, which is not the seat of the U.S. government. What's the difference between you and the ambassador in D.C.?
Well, to put it very simplistically, embassies deal with governments. In other words, they do government to government. Consulates deal with people, with communities, so it's people to people. Roughly, that's the division of labor. So my job is to build bridges to communities. I don't deal with the State Department. I don't deal with the White House. I deal with local government, municipal government, state-level government. But most of our work is to develop ties to communities.
So how important is New York? How important are the Jews of New York to anything having to do with Israel?
Well, I think there's one very basic, simple indication. Our mission here in New York is the largest diplomatic mission Israel maintains worldwide. It's much bigger than any embassy. And I believe it's an indication to the importance Israel is attaching to the greater New York area.
This interview happens to come at a tough time for Israel-U.S. relations, rising anti-Semitism in Europe as well, also a lot of war in the Middle East. And I want to get your take on each of these developments. President Obama doesn't seem to accept Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement that he still believes in a two-state solution after Mr. Netanyahu seemed to go back and forth on that before and after the election. What do you make of the president not taking yes for an answer?
Well, you know, it's not for me to comment on what the president said or not, but here's the situation that our viewers should be aware of. In Israel, the commander-in-chief is the cabinet. And the cabinet is formed through a very lengthy process of coalition building. By the end of the process, there's an agreement that is signed. It's a legal contract between the partners in the coalition. And that agreement includes and contains the policy guidelines of the government. The last four Israeli governments are committed, were committed and remain committed to the two-state solution. Just as the last four administrations in the United States, since the first administration of George W. Bush, were committed and are committed to the two-state solution.
So what was that just before the election when I think it was a settler-oriented media outlet asked Prime Minister Netanyahu, so there will be no Palestinian state on your watch in your next term? And he said, correct.
Well, here's the interpretation of what was said. I believe that the Prime Minister meant that in the current circumstances, when the region around us is up in flames, when nation states are crumbling all around us, when the Palestinians adopted not only rejectionism, but they adopted the ill-conceived strategy of trying to apply external pressure on Israel by appealing to third parties like the United Nations and other international bodies, that the viability of such an agreement is very, very low. And I think that's what he was referring to.
What President Obama has said on several occasions is that the Prime Minister's remarks, or let's say a general lack of initiative toward a two-state solution, even if the official position is wanting one when it's right, threatens Israel's status as a democracy and as a Jewish state, President Obama's words, because it's been almost 50 years, and you can't rule over millions of people with no national voting rights forever. Do you agree or disagree with the president?
The facts are that the reason why we don't have peace today is because the Palestinians turned down every proposal that was proposed to them to accept a territorial compromise. The first time they did it was in Camp David in 2000 when President Clinton put forth a very generous, far-reaching compromise. The second time was, of course, the aftermath of the unilateral pullout of Israel from Gaza in 2005. And then the last time was when our former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, offered them 100% of all of their territorial demands in 2008. And then again, they declined. So I believe the reason why we don't have peace with the Palestinians is their ongoing habitual refusal to accept our right to exist as a national homeland for the Jewish people.
Is there a conundrum for Israel, which is, since there are rejectionists out there who probably would use a new Palestinian state to increase, this is just my analysis and a going analysis that I've read many times, probably use a new Palestinian state at that time to increase attacks on Israel, to try to thwart it. Is there a conundrum for Israel that you risk more terrorism in the short run with a two-state solution, but you can't get terrorism off your back in the long run without one?
Who we're going to sign the agreement with? Let's look at the Palestinian Authority headed by Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. They, a couple of years ago, formed a political alliance with Hamas. Hamas is recognized internationally as a terrorist organization, not just by Israel. It is recognized as a terrorist organization by the United Nations, by Russia, by the United States, by the European Union, what's called the International Quartet. And so, to what extent can we trust an agreement signed with a Palestinian leader who just formed an alliance with a terrorist organization and will not back on this decision?
Moving on. There is so much war in the Arab world, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen now, the Saudis, Iranians, Al-Qaeda, all fighting each other in Yemen through different factions. Does this affect Israeli security, even though it's not directly about Israel?
Well, you know, the only thing that we can do is very closely monitor the situation in the Middle East. Obviously, in our eyes, what we're seeing is the undoing of the old order that was established during the Sykes-Picot agreements and the years following the Sykes-Picot agreement of 1916. We believe that we're looking at a Middle East that is realigning itself according to tribal and religious affiliations, and the nation state is in danger. There's no question about it. It's a regional phenomenon, and all we have to do is monitor the situation very closely and, of course, protect our own self-interest.
And anti-Semitism is rising in Europe and apparently on American college campuses. How much do you see the problem getting worse in recent years?
Well, I think it's certainly a problem. We see it all over the place. Unfortunately, this time around is a different form of anti-Semitism. It derives mostly from anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism. And of course, you see the old classic anti-Semitism as well. But what you're seeing, especially on campuses, is more anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism than classic anti-Semitism.
After the anti-Semitic attack on a Jewish market in Paris, Prime Minister Netanyahu called on all European Jews to move to Israel. I'd never heard anything like that from an Israeli leader as a kind of safety imperative. Of course, you always want Jews to make aliyah, to move to Israel if they choose to do so. But to say as a safety imperative, all European Jews should move to Israel, it sounds like 1933. Do you think that reflects a growing seriousness of the situation there?
Well, he didn't urge them to move to Israel. We should be accurate. All he said is that Israel is there in case they'd like to. Let me remind our viewers, in 1976, that famous raid on Entebbe when the Prime Minister lost his brother, Yonatan Netanyahu, the people that were on the plane, the number of Israelis, there were only a handful of Israelis. The vast majority of people that were held in captivity by the terrorists were Jews. French Jews and European Jews, and so Israel sees itself as a safe haven for all Jews. It is our historical duty to provide them with safety and security wherever they are, whether they're in France or in the United States.
How much do you also see anti-Semitism rising on college campuses in the United States? Because there's a big debate. There's certainly a lot of anti-Israel sentiment on college campuses, but we have to be honest and be able to distinguish demonstrations against Israeli policies, which people could have legitimate disagreements with, from anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. The most critical group of people when it comes to Israeli policies are the Israelis themselves. There's no question about it. The most critical media in the world regarding Israel's actions is the Israeli media itself. There's no question about it. Now, when people on campus go beyond legitimate criticism and they say, this is not legitimate for you to do that. All countries in the world have the right to promote themselves, not Israel. All the countries in the world have the right to promote their symphonies or their modern ballet groups, not Israel. That's what's happening on campus. That's anti-Semitism. When you say every person is allowed to go into this restaurant but not Jews, that's anti-Semitism.
But they say it's because they see Israeli policies as so abhorrent with the occupation of the Palestinian people going on for so long. So it's certainly hooked, and I think what people would say, to Israeli government policies, not to the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, correct?
Here's what's suspicious about this position. Lack of accountability. To say Israel is on the wrong side of this issue is something that, as I said before, is legitimate and is acceptable to many Israelis. But to completely ignore the other side and not to hold the other side accountable for their action, I think that's the problem. And to me, it sounds like an excuse to challenge the very legitimacy of the existence of the State of Israel, which is a form of anti-Semitism.
Part of your job, from what I've been reading and seeing, is to market your country. You're talking about Israel promoting itself on campus, both to New Yorkers in general and to Israeli Jews who have moved here, people who you want to maintain a connection, maybe even move back someday. And that marketing includes college visits. So catch your breath while we watch a 2-minute video clip of you. We're going to show Ambassador Aharoni speaking to Yale students about branding a country.
In our case, by the way, we discovered that the American people feel that they have plenty of information about Israel, so they think they're very knowledgeable. But what they know, they don't necessarily hold in high regard. If you will not take the proactive approach and define your own brand identity, whether you're a soft beverage or you're a country, rest assured your competition will do it for you. There is no vacuum. We were looking for the one thing that you, the people of the world, will be able to accept about Israel, that will be authentic, reliable, and attractive at the same time. Creativity, the creative spirit, it comes from the DNA of our culture. The permission to ask questions, the permission to test boundaries, the permission to challenge authority, the permission to argue. It makes it very unpleasant sometimes to do business with Israelis, but at the same time, the argumentative nature is the driving force behind Israeli creativity. This is the reason why there are so many startup companies in Israel. This is the reason why we have more scientific papers published per capita in Israel than any other place. This is the reason why we have more patents registered per capita than any other nation. This is the reason why Israelis are so creative and innovative. This is something that we didn't have to redefine. We simply had to uncover. It was there the whole time.
Ido Aharoni, our guest, speaking to students at Yale. You're selling argumentativeness as a good thing?
Well, it's not about moral judgment. It's about who you are. And by the way, the beauty of powerful place branding strategy is that it has to reflect the plus and the minus, the good and the bad. Like the Big Apple in New York is a beautiful example, because the apple stands for something, especially for people of faith. Represents temptation, has a biblical religious meaning. It's about the good and the bad. You come to New York, you should know there's plus and there's minus. Same thing about Israel.
And marketing a country like a soft drink, you said? Shouldn't a country be based on higher ideals?
Absolutely. And the task of marketing a nation essentially is no different than marketing any other product, of course, with the complexity. What is the main problem with marketing a place, a city, or a country is that you don't control the product. When you market a beverage, a soft beverage, or a computer, or any other product, you have a full degree of control over all the dimensions of the product. When you market a place, the people that live in the place serve as the ambassadors of the place. Every New Yorker is an ambassador of New York as a brand. Every Israeli is an ambassador of Israel as a brand. It's very difficult. So the job is really to find out what is it that defines the brand? What is the competitive advantage? What is the relative advantage of the place? So in the case of let's say, Nashville, it's country music. In the case of Paris, it's romance. In the case of Brazil, it's fun. And in the case of Israel, we believe it's Israeli unique creative spirit.
Innovation. Talk about Israel as the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. Is that the way you would want to put it?
Yeah, we use the term Silicon Wadi, Silicon Creek. But yes, Israel today is a hub of innovation. Israeli society is one of the societies in the world that knows how to nurture creativity and innovation. The creative class in Israel, to use a term coined by Richard Florida, is fast growing. And today we are in a situation where of our 8 research universities, 3 are included in the top 100 universities in the world. We have the second largest contingent to NASDAQ. We have about 4,000 startup companies. Only in New York itself, we have 400 Israeli startup companies.
400 Israeli startup companies in New York?
In New York, most of them in Manhattan.
So why are they Israeli and here as opposed to Israeli and Israel?
Because here it's easier to raise money in Wall Street. Here there is an ecosystem, and of course the great work of Mayor Bloomberg, and now continued by Mayor de Blasio, to turn New York into a startup-friendly environment. I think it attracts many Israeli companies.
And how's the tech campus coming along on Roosevelt Island? People may not know that that's not just Cornell, which usually it's referred to as a Cornell Tech campus, but it's Cornell Technion campus. Technion is the Israeli Institute of Technology.
Yes, and I just spent a weekend with the president of Technion in Florida, and it's coming along very well. As you probably know, it will be catering to graduate students, masters and PhDs. Altogether, they're not looking to having more than 3,000 students. They're scheduled to open their doors by the end of 2017, early 2018. Right now, they're in the Google building, housed by Google. The campus is already working. They have 80 students enrolled, and I just visited there a few weeks ago, and it's inspirational to see the kind of work that is being done there. I believe that's the future.
Other collaborations with universities in New York in the works? CUNY, to take a random example, or anyone else?
Well, we'd love CUNY to get involved with Israeli institutions. I can tell you that we have partnerships left and right. Israeli universities are very, very active. And I can say, as someone, as an Israeli who studied here in the United States, that are thousands of Israeli academics that obtained their degrees, their masters and their PhDs in the United States, then went back to Israel. So just by the very fact that there is such a tight interaction between the institutions, I think that's a major catalyst.
And you're looking, I gather, for more American students to study abroad in Israel. Is that correct?
That's true. Unfortunately, we're underperforming in that area. Hopefully, thanks to programs such as Birthright and Masai and similar programs that expose Israel to the American student, we'll get more students from the United States. After all, we do have a very friendly infrastructure to the American students. We offer courses in English. We offer great degrees from great universities such as the Hebrew U, Technion, Tel Aviv U, Weizmann Institution, and so on.
From a branding standpoint, does the occupation, does even the continuing elections of Prime Minister Netanyahu, when you're looking at a city like New York, where so many of the Jews are liberal, and roll their eyes and say, oh no, he says he speaks for all the Jews of the world, so he doesn't speak for me. Does it make it more of a branding challenge to disconnect all of that stuff from the kind of larger ongoing vision of Israeli society that you seem interested in communicating?
Right. It's a misperception to think that we're trying to detach Israel from the hardships of life in the Middle East. That's not the case. We believe that the geopolitics of the Middle East, the conflict, as you refer to it, is part of who we are. And the creativity as the long-term strategy, as the overarching principle, certainly contains that, because there is no way to survive in our region without developing a high degree of creativity and innovation. Just as, by the way, for many years, crime was part of life in every major American urban center, especially here in New York in the 70s. Detroit was connected with crime, and Chicago definitely 80, 70 years ago. So there are ways for places to blossom and flourish without detaching themselves from their weaknesses and their problems. The only thing that we need to do is to find a way to turn Israel into a relevant place. It's okay to disagree with Israeli government policies. It's not okay to judge Israel as a society only by the imperfections of its policies.
Thank you for sitting for a wide-ranging interview. Happy Passover.
Happy Passover. Thank you so much for having me.